Good evening. My name is John Thomas. I'm a member of the Kennedy School faculty and the faculty chair of our program with Singapore. The Kennedy School has had strong links with Southeast Asia and particularly the National University of Singapore, and so it's a great pleasure for me to be here and preside over this event tonight. On behalf of the Harvard Project for Asian and International Relations, the Harvard Chinese Students Association, the Kennedy School's Asia Program, and the Institute of Politics, I'd like to welcome you all to the forum. I have the great pleasure tonight to introduce Mr. Rodolfo Severino, who is the Secretary General of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Mr. Severino has been the Secretary General of ASEAN since 1998. He's been in charge during a period of considerable change. Many of you will recall that up until the mid-1990s, ASEAN was a close-knit group of six, fairly homogeneous nations that had some clear understandings, and expanded to 10, and with considerably more diversity. Also, he has been Secretary General during the period of the aftermath of the Asian economic crisis, which has again presented a real challenge for the region and for ASEAN. Secretary General Severino came to this post with a very distinguished background. He has a degree in international studies from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He served in the Philippine Embassy in Washington for a total of 7 years, and then moved to Beijing in the mid-70s, where he was very critical in helping normalize the relationships between the Philippines and China. Mr. Severino also served as Consul General of the Philippines in Houston, Texas, and as the Philippines Ambassador to Malaysia. He also was the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, overseeing ASEAN-related matters. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce to you Secretary General Rodolfo Severino, who is going to speak on ASEAN and the challenges of globalization. Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. I wish to thank the Kennedy School of Government for inviting me to this distinguished forum. I feel that this is a great privilege for me to be here. As Professor Thomas said, I'd like to speak about Southeast Asia and the association in which the countries of that area have chosen to organize themselves, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I'll also speak about why and how ASEAN has to transform itself in order to meet the challenges of today, including those arising from the phenomenon called globalization. But first, a few facts, just to put things in perspective. The 10 countries of Southeast Asia, which are now all members of ASEAN, have more than 520 million people, about half the population of China, with a combined gross domestic product of 556 billion US dollars, about the same as China's. Southeast Asia straddles the sea lanes between East Asia and Europe and the Middle East. It is a region of immense diversity, any way you look at it. Its people speak a babel of languages, although the elites use English as a way of communicating with one another. Most of the people in Southeast Asia adhere to Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, or the two major branches of Buddhism. but to numerous versions of these religions, plus any number of indigenous ones. Southeast Asia has an enormous variety of plant and animal life. Tens of thousands of plant and animal species, some 25% of the world's bird species, 23% of mammals, and 18% of its plants. The list is growing as more species are discovered. And of course, the region makes up a rich tapestry of cultures. Like most other regions of the world, Southeast Asia has had its share of wars, centuries of them, in fact, mostly between the great kingdoms of the mainland and between the sultanates and tribes of maritime Southeast Asia, and of course between them and the colonial powers of the West. But the area now seems to have entered into an era of regional peace. Amidst their great diversity of cultures, religions, languages, historical experiences, and natural endowments, and a history of conflict, the countries of Southeast Asia seem in recent decades to have found enough affinity and enough interests in common to work together in many areas of endeavor, to the point of aspiring to become a free trade area or even an integrated economy and all that that implies. There is one other fact about Southeast Asia of recent decades, and that is the remarkable economic dynamism of the region. The members of ASEAN have deliberately adopted a market-driven approach to development, although not without some direction from the state. They have consciously kept themselves open to and actively linked with the rest of the world, with largely open trading regimes and a welcoming stance toward foreign direct investment. Private enterprise and entrepreneurship have been encouraged. The result was the rapid economic growth of the 1980s and the 1990s until the onset of the financial crisis of 1997. In the period 1988 to 1996, the average real GDP expansion of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand hit between 6.3 and 9.2%, probably the highest in the world. The financial crisis of 1997 and 1998 ravaged most of the economies of the region and called into question the Southeast Asian model, indeed the East Asian model of development. But then, with adjustments and reforms, the now 10 ASEAN members expect regional economic growth to average 3.5 to 4% this year, a respectable rate in a sluggish global economy. According to the US-ASEAN Business Council, Southeast Asia is today the 5th largest export market of the United States, behind only Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and Japan. US exports to ASEAN amounted to 47 billion US dollars in 2000, 3 times the exports of the US to China. US investments in ASEAN are larger than those in Mexico or Brazil, and about the same as US investments in Japan, about 5 times US investments in China. Now, what is ASEAN's role in Southeast Asia's development? What value does ASEAN add to it? Let us look back at ASEAN's history. I would look at that history as having two stages. The first was the period of consolidation and stabilization, the 25 years from ASEAN's founding in 1967 to about 1992. The second stage is the period since then, a time when ASEAN has been expanding the area of stabilization, moving on the road to regional economic integration, and seeking regional solutions for regional problems. ASEAN was founded in very unpromising circumstances, or perhaps it was because things were so inauspicious that Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand found it necessary to get together in a regional association. Indonesia had just undergone a traumatic change of regimes and emerged from a period of confrontation with Malaysia and Singapore. Malaysia and Singapore had just been through an acrimonious separation. The Philippines was continuing to pursue its claim to Sabah and was being challenged by an internal insurgency that it perceived was somehow connected to events in China, then in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, and in Vietnam. Thailand felt threatened by the communist regimes next door and a communist insurgency in its northeast. It was in this situation, in fact, it was in response to it, that the 5 countries formed ASEAN after several previous attempts at various forms of regional association. They did so in order to provide a regional framework and environment in which disputes could be dealt with peacefully and without resort to force. They gathered together partly as a hedge against further embroilment in the rivalries of powers much stronger than they. Even then, even with Indochina in turmoil and in the tightening grip of communism, and with Burma determined to stay out of international organizations, ASEAN was, from the beginning, declared open for membership to all countries in Southeast Asia. In the meantime, Southeast Asia remained divided between ASEAN's then 5 members and the rest. By 1975, Vietnam had been reunited under Hanoi, Cambodia had fallen under communist rule, and Laos stayed firmly allied to Vietnam. Burma remained outside these developments. The situation was complicated by the 1978 invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam. With support from China, the United States, and a majority in the United Nations, ASEAN opposed this use of force against a country by a more militarily powerful neighbor, even as ASEAN dealt with the hordes of both people that fled the turmoil in the former Indo-Chinese states. Thus, in its first quarter century of existence, ASEAN sought to stabilize the region by consolidating the foundations and processes of the association, providing a framework and an environment for peaceful relations among its members, and taking a leading part in the management of the new situation that emerged from the Vietnam War. ASEAN entered its next and present stage around 19 1992. By then, the Cambodian question had been settled. The Cold War had ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the USSR, and the toppling of communist power in Russia. China was rapidly opening itself to the world economy and within its own society. The Rio Earth Summit brought to the world's collective consciousness the fragility of the global environment and its relationship to development. The international community was confronting new problems that transcended national boundaries, like HIV/AIDS, and old ones, like trafficking in drugs and people. Not least, the combination of technology, international agreement, state policy, and corporate action that is shaping the current phenomenon referred to as globalization was gathering momentum. The ASEAN response to this new situation was threefold. It expanded the region of stability that was the subject of its immediate concern. It embarked on the integration of the regional economy, and it stepped up its efforts to work out regional solutions to regional problems. The end of the Cold War dissolved the regional security configuration in East Asia with nothing to replace it. With formal alliances losing their old prominence, East Asia and the Pacific, at the very least, needed a forum in which to talk about regional security issues in the new situation. And after years of conflict and mutual suspicion, build confidence among themselves, among the countries of the region, and other powers with interests in it. In response to this need, ASEAN in 1994 gathered into what it called the ASEAN Regional Forum its then dialogue partners, Australia, Canada, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Russia, New Zealand and the United States, its observer, Papua New Guinea, its future dialogue partners, China and Russia, and later, as it became another dialogue partner, India, and finally, Mongolia and North Korea. Meanwhile, ASEAN brought into membership the remaining countries of Southeast Asia. Vietnam in 1995, Laos and Myanmar in 1997, and Cambodia in 1999. This not only realized the vision of ASEAN's founders of having all the countries of Southeast Asia within ASEAN, it also responded to the strategic imperative for Southeast Asians to heal the divisions of the past and together deal with the challenges coming from the new security situation in the region and from the gathering momentum of globalization. In the beginning of the 1990s, the countries of Southeast Asia recognized that they had to plug more firmly into the globalizing world economy if they were to survive the inevitable onslaught of competition and take their share of the expanding global economy. After all, the market economies of Southeast Asia had achieved their phenomenal growth on the strength of their openness to foreign trade and foreign direct investment. They also recognized that they had to move together and integrate the regional economy if they were to compete successfully for markets and investments. Thus, at its summit meeting in 1992, ASEAN decided to make itself into a free trade area. by a certain date. Essentially, by reducing and eventually abolishing tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade among themselves. At the beginning of this year, ASEAN largely achieved its target, which had been twice advanced. Its target of dropping tariffs to no more than 5% or eliminating them altogether on trade among the 6 original signatories to the AFTA agreement, which happened to be the region's leading trading nations: Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Integrating the regional economy, of course, calls for more than tariff cutting among the 6 more economically advanced countries. The 4 newer members have to move faster in taking down their own tariffs. All have to chip away at the non-tariff barriers among themselves. Customs procedures have to be streamlined and coordinated. Product standards have to be harmonized. Transportation links, aviation, sea transport, highways and railways, gas pipelines, all these have to be welded together if goods are to move more freely within the region. A regional approach to the development and use of information technology has to be taken. Not least, ASEAN countries have to free up trade in services, finance, business services, construction, communications, transport, tourism, and so on. We are working on all this, but progress, for a variety of reasons, has been slow. Meanwhile, certain problems have arisen that transcend national boundaries and therefore have to be dealt with regionally. The environment, particularly the haze that periodically arises from a combination of natural forces and human activity, HIV/AIDS and other communicable diseases, drug trafficking, the trafficking in people and other transnational crimes, and now terrorism. ASEAN now cooperates in all these areas. So what next for ASEAN? As ASEAN's stage of regional stabilization and consolidation took 25 years. It has been 10 years since the association embarked on the stage of expanding the scope of regional stabilization, integrating the regional economy, and strengthening regional cooperation. It is time for ASEAN to go on to the next stage, the stage of competitiveness. For ASEAN to compete in the global economy today, the regional economy has to be brought to a much deeper and broader state of integration than its members have so far been willing to undertake. This has become urgent with the rapid rise of continent-sized economies like China and India, with their increasing openness, attractiveness to investors, and greater economic vigor, and other integrating markets like Mercosur in South America. ASEAN has publicly expressed alarm over the trend in East Asia of new foreign direct investment flowing in increasing volumes to China instead of to ASEAN as in the past. The fact is that ASEAN is perceived to be far from the level of integration of China's national economy with its huge population and rapid growth. From this concern arises a renewed ASEAN resolve to deepen and broaden its economic integration. The question is whether the ASEAN countries are willing to make the political decisions to bring this about. The regional economic integration required for ASEAN to be competitive has implications far beyond the merely economic. Not only are political decisions required for regional economic integration and competitiveness, economic integration will have important political consequences. For example, closer regional integration would require stronger regional institutions with greater authority than the ASEAN Secretariat is currently allowed to wield, more binding economic agreements, the standardization of products and of safety and environmental requirements, the coordination of national policies, the authority to ensure compliance with such agreements and measures, the power to adjudicate disputes. This would mean voluntarily ceding a measure of sovereignty for regional purposes. This would, in turn, call for a sufficiently high degree of mutual trust among the member states. Mutual trust would, in turn, have to derive from a deeply felt sense of community and popular support for regionalism. As it is, pressures for regional economic integration come mainly from Japanese and American business rather than from ASEAN enterprises, much less from the ASEAN public. ASEAN would also have to strengthen its protection of intellectual property and bring down levels of official and corporate corruption, areas where it might have an advantage over China in the competition for foreign investments. Regional economic integration is intended to improve ASEAN's attractiveness to investments, but individual ASEAN countries will still have to compete for those investments among themselves. This would mean strengthening those factors that make them individually attractive: the rule of law, predictable policies, respect for contracts, an independent judiciary, adequate infrastructure, accessibility in terms of transportation and communications, a commitment to training and education, stability and security in the country as well as in the region. All this would tend to standardize norms of governance in an upward direction. One thing ASEAN has going for it is its policy of tightening economic links with other countries and groups of countries. It is about to conclude with China an agreement to build an ASEAN-China free trade area. It is working on deepening its long-established economic ties with Japan. It is developing measures to facilitate trade with Australia and New Zealand and remove obstacles to that trade. It is studying a proposal from the United States business community for an ASEAN-US free trade area. It is exploring linkages with India as well. All this would help ASEAN in its drive for competitiveness. At the same time, ASEAN will have to cooperate much more closely and more actively in such areas as the environment, HIV/AIDS, and other communicable diseases, trafficking in drugs and people, and other transnational crimes. Such cooperation is necessary not only for its own sake, but also for the sake of strengthening the foundations for regionalism and cultivating the mutual trust necessary for further economic integration. In the end, an integrated and competitive ASEAN would bolster regional stability and fortify its influence in the world. For ASEAN then, the question today is whether its members have the vision and political fortitude to take the steps necessary to move to the next stage in its history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Severino. As is traditional in the forum, we will have an opportunity to ask questions. There are 2 microphones on either side. I would ask that each person asking a question identify themselves, and I would also ask the usual, please be sure it's a question, because when it begins to become a speech, I will intervene and try to get it to be a question. Seem to have a larger group on the right, so let me start over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Secretary General, for joining us today. My name is Peter Tynan, and I'm here at the Kennedy School. You touched on the relationship between ASEAN and Australia, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and whether you thought it was desirous of Australia to join ASEAN, and if so, what you thought would be the major constraints to doing so.
Yeah, Australia is one of the oldest of ASEAN's dialogue partners. In the 1977 summit, the then Prime Minister of Australia, as well as New Zealand, met with the ASEAN leaders. So the relationship has been going on for a long time. And about 3 years ago, the ASEAN economic ministers and those of Australia and New Zealand appointed a task force to study the ways of getting the economies of ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand together, how to link them together. And the task force came up with several recommendations, including the possibility of a free trade area between ASEAN and the CER, the closer economic relations between Australia and New Zealand. However, ASEAN thought that free trade area might be too ambitious at this time. And so, as I said in my presentation, they settled for overcoming the obstacles that are currently in the way of increased trade between ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand, and that's moving satisfactorily. The ministers, the same ministers, signed a declaration last month embodying this agreement to overcome the obstacles to trade between the 2 sides. But as for membership in ASEAN, that is not in the cards at this time. ASEAN is, from the beginning, envisioned as an association of countries in Southeast Asia.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Tony Lambino. I'm from the Philippines, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I worked for Paul Dominguez, who's a big fan of yours, back home. Anyway, I just had to put that in. You mentioned that to boost competitiveness of ASEAN, intellectual property rights will have to be enforced better. Some people argue that this will create problems in access for the people in ASEAN, especially with regard to intellectual property products from the West. If yes, is this a sacrifice that ASEAN just has to make?
No, I think what you're referring to is the problem with intellectual property rights, particularly with respect to access to pharmaceuticals that are needed for, say, the treatment of HIV/AIDS. Yes, that is a concern of ASEAN, and in fact, the position that ASEAN has taken in this matter is when the leaders issued their declaration on HIV/AIDS, is that the primacy of accessibility to pharmaceuticals to cure or to treat deadly diseases has to be upheld. But I was talking of intellectual property in general, for example, the piracy of technology, of industrial technology, and some of the more dramatic examples are in the area of sound recording and video recording. This is what I meant. The question of patents on drugs is another issue.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Boll, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And if you could answer the next question, this would really help my research. It's regarding the ASEAN Investment Agreement. And I'm curious, how is this agreement being implemented in the nation states? If I'm a foreign investor, and I know ASEAN has the very ambitious goal to open up to FDI, to foreign direct investment, for foreigners coming into ASEAN within the next 10 years, can I, as a foreign investor, refer to this ASEAN investment agreement? Or do I have to refer to the FDI laws which I have in the different member states, and they are then obliged to use this agreement?
You know, the ASEAN Investment Area Agreement is an agreement to open up the investment regimes, first to ASEAN investors, which include, the term ASEAN investors includes the joint ventures with foreigners, so it's not an exclusive arrangement. And at a later phase to all investors. But this is a commitment on the part of the ASEAN countries to one another, and to give effect to this, they have to enact their legislation.
Okay, thank you. This answered it, and it helps.
My name is Makio Kitazawa, a first-year student of business school. I have one question. What kind of human resources does ASEAN need mostly to develop its business sector?
The question of human resource development has been recognized as of primary importance to ASEAN. The so-called CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, the newer members, have explicitly recognized this as the key to their development and to narrowing the development gap between them and the older members. And this is clearly recognized. And when you ask what kind, it's really all kinds. One, the management of government policy, or even the formulation of government policy, that's one. Another is in the area of information technology, which clearly demands highly trained, or at least the conversant people to participate in the information revolution. And in many areas of industry and agriculture. So this is recognized as key to development. And when you ask what kind, I could say all kinds.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is David Madden. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I guess my question, just as someone who's sort of studied ASEAN over the last 10 years, as I'm sure many people in this room have, I mean, a lot of the themes that you raised tonight are very familiar themes, the need for, I guess, stronger institutions, to authority to ensure compliance, and a whole bunch of things that I guess are familiar themes with ASEAN. Now, earlier this year, we saw the leaders of the African nations get together and recognise that, I guess, that their regional body carried certain baggage with it that was affecting its ability to move forward as a regional organisation. Has ASEAN reached that point now where, after 25 years, and a lot of these fundamental issues not sort of advancing on. Is that the stage that ASEAN has reached now?
As I said, it has reached the stage where it must move on. We have done pretty well in managing possible conflicts within the region. We have laid the foundations for regional economic integration. Now it's the time to move on, and this would require the right institutions. And if you ask, have we reached that stage? Well, we have reached a stage where we must do it, but we haven't done so yet.
But does that mean the invention of a new regional body? Like
No,
the
no. ASEAN itself has undergone a transformation over the years, particularly this watershed year of 1992. It has, in my mind, it has to move to the next stage. So we haven't been there yet, but we have reached a point where we must go in that direction.
Good evening, Secretary General. I'm Sebastian James. I'm in the Kennedy School. My question is, how does ASEAN sees itself as a counterbalancing force with respect to China in East Asia, political and economic? Because you kept referring to China a lot. And secondly is, how come we don't say any political statements regarding Taiwan or the Spratly Islands, which are very intricately connected with the ASEAN?
Yeah. No, ASEAN does not consider itself as a counterweight to China. It is a close neighbor, and it is in ASEAN's interest to have good relations with China, as it is in China's interest to have good relations with ASEAN. And this is where things are moving. China has fixed most of its border problems with its neighbors, including Russia, India, Vietnam, except for what you referred to, the South China Sea. And in that regard, ASEAN and China are working toward what they call a code of conduct for managing behavior with respect to the South China Sea, pending the resolution of the legal claims. But in the meantime, while the code of conduct is being worked on, it seems that the elements that are being discussed for that code of conduct are being complied with. Now, as I said earlier, China is rising as a competitor for ASEAN, and ASEAN has two basic choices for meeting this challenge. One choice is to close itself off to China, fend off the challenge in the best way that it can. And the other choice is to strengthen its links with China, enable trade to expand between ASEAN and China, encourage mutual investment, and in general strengthen the economic linkages between ASEAN and China. ASEAN and China have taken the latter choice. And as I said, the leaders are about to sign an agreement to start building a free trade area between ASEAN and China.
Good evening, Secretary General. My name is Zachary Abuse. I'm a professor of political science at Simmons College, where I teach Southeast Asian politics. My question to you is, if you want to move ASEAN forward to the next level that you've spoken of, will you have to revisit two of the core ASEAN principles, and that is consensus-style decision-making, which leads, or the so-called ASEAN way, which leads to often the least common denominator of decision-making? And second, will you have to revisit the policy of strict non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and go back to some of the policies that were put forward by the Thai Foreign Minister Surin Pitsuwan, that you're going to need to have selective engagement in the when issues cross borders?
Yeah, first of all, just to look at this in general terms, the matter of the requirement of a consensus is certainly not unique to ASEAN. Most or all regional associations operate in this way, and in most instances, even the United Nations operates that way. In fact, even the European Union, in most important decisions, demand not just consensus, but unanimity. However, I think the concern that is being raised by this is that what you call the least common denominator approach. And it is the idea of waiting for the slowest member. In fact, last month, the economic ministers decided or agreed to give effect to what is rather awkwardly termed ASEAN minus X principle, which is that in implementing those agreements that have already been adopted, ASEAN countries need not wait for one another, but those who are ready can move ahead. So I think that this is some kind of a breakthrough in order to get out of this log jam that is created by having to wait all the time for everybody to be ready. The other point is this question of non-interference. Again, speaking generally, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of nations is not an ASEAN invention. It, in fact, underpins the whole system of international relations. Now, having said that, I hasten to add that in cases where outside intervention is required, for example, the haze problem, which originates in basically in Indonesia. Indonesia has been leaned on in order to take the necessary measures to prevent the causes of haze from happening. In fact, last June, ASEAN came to an agreement on transboundary haze pollution, which requires each member to first of all, prevent haze, and then if the fires do occur, to facilitate the movement of people and equipment across borders in order to deal with a fire. Now, I'm sure in the minds of people when this question of non-interference arises is the question of human rights. ASEAN, of course, the different countries in ASEAN have different views of this, and of course, Consurin has well-known views on this matter. And if human rights violations spill over in the form of repercussions on neighboring states, then those states that are affected do take action. But the setting of regional norms is not yet, we have not yet reached that stage, as for example in the case of Western Europe or the American states, where certain norms of human rights are explicitly established for even as a condition for membership. There is such a wide diversity in ASEAN on this matter that it is not possible at this stage to have these norms adopted and enforced.
We're running out of time. We'll take one last question, and then we'll give the Secretary General a moment to make any concluding comments he would like to make.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Gregor Chappelle. I come from Belgium, and I learned a lot tonight because I'm not quite familiar to ASEAN's goals, so thanks a lot. I was precisely going to address the human rights issue, as I noticed that you did not address the human rights and democracy issue while mentioning free trade, environment, healthcare. And I was going to ask you, but I believe you answered me, does, for instance, ASEAN have a position about the criminal against humanity currently in power in Burma? But perhaps my question must now be, would it be a goal of ASEAN to have such objectives and such goals in the future? Do you think that in the short term ASEAN could focus on such questions?
Certainly, ASEAN is concerned about gross and widespread violations of human rights. But as I said, the diversity is such that, and the rather young nature of ASEAN is such that this kind of sensitive issue is not yet a recognized subject for open discussion. But I can assure you that behind closed doors, the situation in Myanmar that you mentioned is discussed.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question instead.
Why don't you just stand up and ask your question? I know you're in line here.
My name is Dennis Sutton. I work for an NGO across the river. And I was just wondering, you mentioned that quite a bit about economic integration and creating links both externally with other trading partners, but also internally within the ASEAN region. I was just wondering, single currency is one of the most obvious examples of economic integration. And do you think that that is something that the ASEAN Association can strive towards? And if so, what would the timeline for that be?
Yeah, before the financial crisis, a common currency was unthinkable. After the financial crisis, it became thinkable. But there are, as you might be aware, there are very great obstacles to the achievement of a euro-like currency in ASEAN. You would need a regional central bank to which you surrender a lot of your ability to make monetary policy, your freedom to adopt certain fiscal policies would also be greatly restricted. So I don't foresee that happening. I remember a forum in which this question was asked, and I replied, pointing to the youngest person in the room. I said, perhaps in your lifetime, but not in mine. But there are steps that that could be taken short of a single currency. And the European Union has been through these steps over the years. For example, what the coordination of the exchange rates and preventing the exchange rates from fluctuating beyond a certain band. Some people call it the snake in the tunnel. Now the currencies fluctuate, but within a certain band. That can be worked out short of a common currency. While we're on the subject of finance, after the financial crisis, the ASEAN countries and China, Japan, and Korea, the so-called ASEAN +3 group, adopted what they call the Chiang Mai Initiative. And one of the elements of this is a network of bilateral currency swap and repurchase agreements which the countries involved would lend one another the hard currency when their own currencies came under attack. And 6 of these bilateral agreements have already been concluded, and 8 more are in various stages of negotiation. So these are some of the steps that could be taken. The coordination of exchange rate policy. The idea of an Asian monetary fund is still alive. Remember when Japan floated this, the United States shut it down immediately. But it's still alive. And perhaps the work that is being undertaken on financial cooperation could lead to an Asian monetary fund that would be in close linkage with the IMF. That's still possible.
Please join me in extending our very sincere thanks to Secretary General.
It's like a currency, no?